CEO wife thought she had already won until the final vote was counted. The champagne was still cold in Marisol Reyes's hand when the chairman read the winner's name, and it wasn't hers. She had saved the company from bankruptcy. She had earned the title everyone in that ballroom expected her to receive. Instead, the board handed the CEO seat to her own husband, the man who had recruited her, married her, and stood beside her for 3 years. He didn't even look surprised. He didn't even look at her. Within an hour, a bartender's quiet warning would send her down a path she never expected, one that would expose a forged signature, a hidden shell company, and a kickback scheme buried in a folder neither of them was supposed to find. She wasn't going to scream. She wasn't going to confront him in a hallway. She was going to do what she did best, follow the paper trail until it told the truth. What she found would not just cost her husband the company. It would cost him everything he built to take it from her. The champagne was still cold in Marisol Reyes's hand when the chairman of the board said her name, and the room went silent in the wrong way. 12 months earlier, Marisol had been the one who saved Calderon Foods from bankruptcy. She had walked into a company drowning in debt, fired half the executive team, renegotiated 3 supplier contracts in a single week, and turned a quarter of losses into the company's best year in a decade. Tonight, in the gold ballroom of the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, Texas, the board had gathered to vote on the new chief executive officer. Everyone in that ballroom, including Marisol, believed the vote was a formality. She had earned it. Across the room stood her husband, Adrian Cole, smiling at her like a man who had nothing to hide. Adrian was the company's chief financial officer, and 3 years ago he had been the one who recruited her, who vouched for her, who told the board she was the smartest operator he had ever worked with. They had married 18 months into her tenure, in a small courthouse ceremony neither of their families fully approved of. She had thought, foolishly perhaps, that the two of them were building something together. The chairman cleared his throat. After careful deliberation, the board has voted 6-3 in favor of Adrian Cole as the next chief executive officer of Calderon Foods. The applause felt like static in Marisol's ears. She looked at Adrian. He was already shaking hands, already being congratulated, already wearing the expression of a man who had expected this all along. He had not looked surprised. He had not looked at her at all. It was the bartender, a quiet young man named Theo who had served her 3 glasses of water that night because she never drank at work events, who leaned in afterward and said something that would not leave her mind. "Ma'am, I don't mean to overstep, but your husband was in here an hour before the vote, on the phone, saying something about the numbers being fixed for tomorrow. I figured it was none of my business." Marisol smiled, thanked him, and walked out of the Driscoll, with her head high and her hands trembling at her sides. She did not cry in the car. She sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes and made a decision instead. She was not going to scream. She was not going to confront him in a hallway. She was going to find out exactly what fixed meant. And she was going to do it the way she did everything else in her career, quietly, patiently, and with documentation. Marisol Reyes had grown up in Corpus Christi, the daughter of a shipping clerk and a high school accountant, and the one lesson her mother drilled into her was that paper never lies, only people do. She had a forensic accounting certification she rarely mentioned, earned during a stretch of unemployment after the 2009 financial collapse, and she had used it exactly twice in her career, once to catch a vendor padding invoices, and now, for the second time, to find out what her husband had done to the most important vote of her life. She started where any accountant starts. The numbers. The CEO vote at Calderon Foods was decided by a weighted shareholder formula board members voted, but their votes were multiplied based on equity held in trust by the founding family, the Calderon family, who had sold the company 8 years earlier but retained a minority voting bloc as part of the sale agreement. Marisol had always assumed the Calderon family trust, now controlled by an elderly widow named Inez Calderon, was a silent, disengaged shareholder. Inez had not attended a board meeting in 4 years. But trusts do not vote themselves. Someone votes on their behalf. Marisol requested, as was her legal right as an outgoing executive of record, the full shareholder voting documentation from the company's general counsel. It took 6 days and one carefully worded email reminding the general counsel of SEC disclosure obligations before the documents arrived. What she found made her sit very still at her kitchen table for a long time. The Calderon Family Trust's voting proxy had been reassigned 4 months earlier not to Inez Calderon, and not to any Calderon family member, but to a new entity called Brightline Capital Advisors, LLC, formed in Delaware only 5 months before the vote. Brightline's listed manager was a name Marisol did not recognize, Felix Donnelly. She had never heard of Felix Donnelly, but Adrian had mentioned him once, months ago, in passing, as an old business school friend who does consulting now. It took 3 weeks of careful work to find out who Felix Donnelly really was. Marisol did not hire a private investigator. She could not risk anyone at the company learning she was digging. Instead, she relied on something better: public records, professional licensing databases, and a former colleague named Priya Nair, who now worked at the Texas Secretary of State's office and owed Marisol a favor from years earlier when Marisol had quietly helped Priya's small business survive an IRS audit. Priya pulled the formation documents for Brightline Capital Advisors, LLC. The registered agent's address matched a UPS mailbox store in Houston. The LLC had no employees, no website, and no clients besides one, the Calderon Family Trust. And the signature authorizing Brightline to manage the trust's voting proxy belonged to Inez Calderon, except the notary stamp on the document was dated for a day when, according to a charity gala guest list Marisol found archived online, Inez Calderon had been photographed at a fundraiser in San Antonio, 400 miles from the notary's listed office in Austin. The signature had been forged, or Inez had signed something she did not understand. Marisol drove to San Antonio the following Saturday alone and requested a meeting with Inez Calderon through her household staff, using only her name and the words, "It concerns your family's company." Inez, 81 years old and sharper than anyone gave her credit for, agreed to see her within the hour. It took less than 20 minutes for Inez to understand what had happened. 6 months earlier, a man named Felix Donnelly had visited her, introduced by a mutual acquaintance, offering to simplify and modernize the trust's voting administration so she would no longer be bothered with company matters at her age. She had signed paperwork in good faith, trusting the recommendation. She had no idea her voting rights had been used to install a new CEO. "Who recommended this man to you?" Marisol asked, already knowing the answer before Inez said it. "Your husband," Inez said. "Adrian. He said it was a kindness, so I wouldn't have to deal with board business anymore." Marisol now had 3 pieces of a puzzle: a forged or fraudulently obtained proxy assignment, a shell company controlled by an associate of her husband, and a board vote that had been decided by that very proxy. Brightline's votes, cast through Donnelly, had supplied the deciding margin. Without them, the vote would have gone 4-3 in Marisol's favor. But she did not yet have proof that Adrian had orchestrated it, only that he had introduced Donnelly to Inez. A good lawyer would call that circumstantial. She needed more. She found it by accident, the way the truth often arrives not through brilliance, but through someone else's carelessness. Adrian had always used the same password manager for both his personal and old work accounts, a habit from years earlier when their marriage was newer and there had been no secrets between them. Marisol still had access to a shared family cloud backup neither of them had ever bothered to disable, used originally for storing tax documents. She was not looking for anything when she opened it to find an old W-2. But sorting by date, she noticed a folder labeled BL Project, last modified 2 days before the vote. Inside were drafts of emails between Adrian and Felix Donnelly, going back 8 months, discussing the transition timeline for the CEO vote, references to keeping M in the dark until the board confirms, and a spreadsheet modeling exactly how many shareholder votes Brightline would need to control to override the executive committee's recommendation, which had been Marisol unanimously before the Calderon Trust proxy was reassigned. There was also buried in the folder a message that confirmed something Marisol had not expected. Adrian had not done this purely out of ambition. There was a financial incentive, a side agreement promising Donnelly 12% of Brightline's consulting fees, which were themselves to be paid out of Calderon Foods' executive budget once Adrian became CEO, a kickback scheme disguised as a vendor contract that would have quietly siphoned company funds to two men who had engineered a fraudulent shareholder vote. Marisol closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. She felt something other than rage. She felt, strangely, calm. She finally understood the shape of what had happened to her. An understanding, she had learned long ago, was the only real antidote to helplessness. She did not confront Adrian. She built a case. She consulted, off the record, and through a former law school classmate named Dorian Hayes, who now specialized in shareholder litigation, on what she had. Dorian confirmed what she suspected. A fraudulently obtained proxy used to swing a corporate vote was not just a civil matter. It potentially violated securities regulations given Calderon Foods' minority public float, and the kickback arrangement, if real, constituted corporate fraud that the board would be legally obligated to investigate the moment it came to light. "You have enough to bring this to the board today," Dorian told her. "Why are you waiting?" "Because if I bring it today, it becomes a scandal with no structure," Marisol said. "I want it to become a correction. There's a difference." She waited 11 more days. During that time, she said nothing to Adrian. She came home, ate dinner across from him, listened to him describe his plans for the company's first year under his leadership, and said nothing. It was, she would later admit, the hardest acting performance of her life. What she was waiting for was the company's quarterly board meeting, the one event where every voting board member, the general counsel, the auditors, and per company bylaws she had read twice over any shareholder of record with proxy authority, would be required to attend in person. Felix Donnelly would have to be there. The boardroom at Calderon Foods' Austin headquarters had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Colorado River, and on the morning of the quarterly meeting, sunlight cut hard lines across the long walnut table. Marisol arrived early, as she always did, and took her seat as outgoing executive of record, there to formally hand over her remaining duties. Adrian sat at the head of the table for the first time as CEO. He looked, Marisol thought, comfortable in a way that made her chest tighten. He had no idea. Felix Donnelly arrived 12 minutes into the meeting, representing Brightline Capital Advisors, there to confirm the trust's continuing voting position on an unrelated agenda item. The approval of a new vendor contract that Marisol now knew, from the documents in that folder, was the very kickback arrangement disguised as a consulting fee. When the chairman opened the floor for any final business, Marisol stood. "Before we vote on the Brightline consulting agreement," she said, "I'd like to submit documentation to the board regarding the validity of Brightline's voting proxy and the circumstances under which it was obtained." The room did not go silent gracefully. It went silent the way a held breath does. She did not raise her voice. She laid out in order exactly what Dorian had helped her organize: the notarized proxy document with its impossible date discrepancy, a sworn written statement from Inez Calderon describing how she had been misled, the formation records of Brightline Capital Advisors showing no legitimate business activity beyond managing the trust's vote, and finally, projected onto the boardroom screen for every board member and the company's outside counsel to see the email thread from the BL project folder, including the kickback structure and the phrase, "keeping M in the dark until the board confirms." Adrian's face did not move for nearly 10 seconds. Then he said quietly, "Marisol, this isn't your misreading." "I'm not reading anything," Marisol said. "I'm showing them what you wrote." Felix Donnelly, to his limited credit, did not attempt to argue. He stood, said he would have his attorney contact the board, and left the room before security arrived, though he would be served with a civil complaint 9 days later and would eventually settle with the Calderon Trust to avoid criminal referral. The board's outside counsel called for an immediate recess. By the time the meeting resumed 2 hours later, the company's auditors had pulled the original vote tabulation. The general counsel had confirmed the proxy reassignment had never been properly ratified under the trust's own governing documents, and the chairman, visibly shaken, informed the room that the CEO vote would need to be voided and reheld with a corrected shareholder roll. Adrian was asked to leave the building pending an internal investigation. He did not look at Marisol on his way out. She did not need him to. The reheld vote took place 3 weeks later, with Inez Calderon's proxy restored to her own control, and with Inez, newly furious and newly engaged with her family's legacy, attending the meeting in person for the first time in 5 years. The board voted 7-2 to install Marisol Reyes as Chief Executive Officer of Calderon Foods. Adrian Cole resigned formally before the company could complete its internal investigation, which limited the criminal exposure his attorneys negotiated down to a civil settlement, requiring him to repay the company for the kickback structure he had attempted to build, along with a permanent 5-year ban from serving as an officer of any company in which the Calderon Trust held shares, a condition the board added unanimously at Inez Calderon's specific request. Marisol filed for divorce the same week she was confirmed as CEO. She did not do it out of spite. She did it because there was nothing left in the marriage worth defending, and she had learned, over 3 months of quiet work, that some betrayals cannot be repaired, only understood and walked away from, with clarity. She kept the house. She did not take anything from Adrian beyond what the courts determined was hers. She did not speak publicly about what had happened, declining 3 interview requests from business journalists who had caught wind of the boardroom reversal. The story that circulated in Austin business circles was simple and true enough. A fraudulent proxy had been discovered and corrected, and the rightful CEO had been installed. 6 months later, Marisol stood again in the gold ballroom of the Driscoll Hotel, this time at the company's annual shareholder dinner, not waiting for a vote, but opening one announcing Calderon Foods' strongest fiscal year in the company's history, achieved under her leadership, with Inez Calderon seated at the head table beside her. The 2 women who had both been quietly deceived by the same man, now rebuilding something neither of them had asked to lose. Theo, the same bartender from that first night, was working the event again. He caught her eye across the room and gave a small, knowing nod. She smiled back, genuinely this time, and realized she did not feel triumphant exactly. She felt something steadier than that. She felt like herself again, fully, for the first time in over a year. She thought, watching the room fill with people who had once doubted her and now stood ready to applaud, that her mother had been right all along. Paper never lies. People sometimes do. But if you are patient enough and careful enough, the paper always finds its way back to the truth. The end.